Hi everyone, it's Chandra Easton here from StarAstrologyHealing.com. I'm an esoteric astrologer and I thought I'd just make a brief talk about what's going on in 2020 from an astrological perspective. I've called this talk The Great Change Part 1, and that's because humanity and the earth are going through a cycle of enormous change. And on the other side of this rebirthing of consciousness, we will have a new civilization, we will have a restructuring and a bringing to the fore all that is good within humanity and on the earth. But unfortunately, in order to get to that point, we need to go through a hard birth. You could liken it to a woman giving birth, and you can't have the baby without the labour pains and then without the great effort of the second stage of labour and the actual birthing of new consciousness from the heart. So it's important to remember that the purpose of the crisis is this birthing of greater consciousness and a focus of we rather than me. And this is all over the planet. Every nation, every race, all peoples are included. So as we go through the great change and the earth goes through this momentous transition, then the cleansing, because it's a cleansing, it's a bit like the cleansing happens in different ways. It happens through fire. Well, we've seen that in Australia with the bushfires, and we see it through drought, and we see it through volcanoes. It happens through famine. We haven't seen that yet, but if we have any of the pyroclastic equatorial volcanoes go off, then we would have a year without a summer, and we would no doubt end up in famine. I'm talking about global famine. Of course, there's famine in certain parts of the planet. So we have cleansing through fire, we have cleansing through earth, we have cleansing through air. And at the moment, of course, and the cleansing through air is through disease or pestilence. And we have a very interconnected society these days. And of course, therefore, because of communication, because of our interconnectedness, then when you have a viral contaminant, such as we do with the coronavirus, then the spread of a disease or pestilence through air can be very great. But equally, the spread of the impulse of compassion and the impulse of sharing and the focus on the we consciousness can happen through the internet. One of the things that's happening with the cleansing through air is directly connected to the movement of the planet Saturn into the sign of Aquarius, and I'll talk more about that later. And the other way we have cleansing, and the cleansing is part of the birthing process. The other way we have cleansing is through water. We can have too much water, we can have contamination of water, we can have oceans rising, we can have floods, cyclones. Yeah, so these are various ways that the earth, who is essentially our mother, brings about balance to the planet. So how do we deal with this in the midst of all this change? Well, we have to learn to take spiritual responsibility and personal responsibility. So we have to be responsible for ourselves, for our loved ones, for our family, for our neighbours, for our community, and open the heart to that consciousness of connection with others. We also have to learn to live simply so that others can simply live. And I think it's important to say that the heart, when it's used as the compass or the point from which we make our decisions, then that creates a sense of protection. So when a nation are making decisions from the heart, then the nation is protected by and large. And when an individual or a community are making heart-based inclusive decisions, then that community is protected. Okay, so that's just a bit of a brief introduction. Now, there are several ways of using astrology to understand what's happening for groups and for humanity as a whole, and indeed for the planet. And I'm going to use two of these methods. One is the solar eclipses and the other is the Ingress charts. And these are two methods of looking at the group dynamics. So we had a very significant solar eclipse, and it occurred on the 26th of December last year on Boxing Day. And if you'd like to know more about that, there's quite a long talk on this on my YouTube channel, and it's called the The Planetary Landscape for 2020. So go to YouTube, type in my name, Chandra Easton, and then search for the Planetary Landscape of 2020. So I'll just mention this briefly, but I won't go back over it. This eclipse occurred in the 4th degree of Capricorn, with a lot of planets in Capricorn, and there were some predictions that I made, and I'll just go over some of these predictions. One of the predictions was the Wall Street crash, and of course we've been having great shudders on the stock market at the moment, and a movement into what they refer to as the what do they call it, the bear movement, into the bear trading, and everything's losing. So that's one of the things that could continue. And I should say that an eclipse, even though it happened on Boxing Day last year, and there was a window of events that occurred 3 weeks beforehand and 3 weeks afterwards. And so, of course, we know now in hindsight that the coronavirus came out of Wuhan in China in that 3 week period before Christmas, even though we didn't hear about it until January. Other things that I predicted that may still happen is the IMF moving to protect the central banks of all countries, and doing this by basically withdrawing cash, making cash illegal, making it impossible over a period of time, not necessarily in 2020, more like 2021, so that we are relying upon digital currency and digital money, and that we are paying the governments and paying the banks to keep our money. And I think that the reason for the IMF's push to protect the banks is because they don't want the banking and the corporate world to collapse. So therefore you can expect that cash will be harder to get and will gradually be withdrawn. One of the other themes was for this eclipse that I spoke about was the contraction of international trade, and particularly in the Australian chart I focused upon that because of where the lineup of planets in Capricorn fell. Another one that I spoke about was the drought, and therefore the run-on effects because of the drought, with hardship for farmers and things like that. I also thought that there would be big volcanic eruptions of the equatorial volcanoes. That hasn't happened thus far, but we did have the White Island volcano go off in New Zealand, and I noticed just this morning that the big volcanoes in Iceland are beginning to show signs of activity. The most dangerous volcanoes to go off are the ones around the Indonesian region, and anywhere around the equator. So therefore think of the big volcano in Central America near Mexico City. Other things that I thought were a possibility were the space race, a war for oil. Yes, and of course one of the things that I completely missed when I looked at the eclipse chart and looked at it in Australia was I'd taken the focus on the planet Vulcan to be very strongly connected to volcanoes, and because volcanoes erupting are part of the way the earth cleanses through fire. But I'd completely overlooked the cleansing in the Australian chart through bushfire. And of course, many communities are still suffering because of the enormous disruption that's occurred with the catastrophic bushfires in, I think it was 3 states in Australia, maybe more than 3 states. Okay, so what I think I'd like to do now is just move on to talk about... just finding the chart here. I think I also talked in the that solar eclipse discussion around the likelihood of recession, and of course this is the big issue that at least the Australian government is trying to defend defend and protect and shore up the monetary world. But the question really must be asked, to what end if money becomes more important than people? Yes, okay, so we'll focus now on the virus that's moved at plague proportions around the world, and particularly the likelihood of impact in Australia of this virus. Now, there's a couple of ways to do this, and what I think I'll do is look at what's known as the Aries Ingress, and this is for the exact minute that the sun moves in 0 degrees Aries, and that is on the 20th of March 2020. And I've focused this Ingress chart around Canberra, the capital of Australia. And of course you could do an Aries Ingress chart. You could do it for Tokyo, you could do it for Beijing, you could do it for the capital of any country, but I've focused this around the Australian chart, and immediately what's noticeable is the crisis in the international sector of the Australian Ingress chart, and that's the 9th house. That's the house of trade. It's the house of people visiting our country. It's the house associated with our exports of coal to China. It's the house associated with the international students or indeed tourists coming into Australia. The entry and exit for trade and for tourism and for industry goes in and out of a country's chart through the 9th house, and this is where the sun sits along with Chiron and Vulcan. So we have a crisis of epidemic proportions to do with trade and internationalism. This is the big economic crisis. If I look at this chart in terms of the pandemic that's going on, the first thing I notice is the destiny point of the chart, the 4th degree of Cancer, sits on the door, the ascendant of the Australian Ingress chart. So you could say that the destiny of all Australians is being directly impacted by all kinds of things that are being imported in through our 9th house, or a failure to import. Now, yes, we have Sun, Vulcan and Chiron in Aries, and this has got a lot to do with the crisis, and it will be, without a doubt, the collapse of industries or businesses. And the Ingress chart lasts from the 21st of March 2020 through until the 20th of June 2020. So it's a 3-month chart. But also we have the planet Neptune, and Neptune is associated with infections and global infections and pandemics and things like that. So Neptune also sits in the 9th house. And so of course it's obvious to all Australians now that we have been unable to separate ourselves from the global situation. What happens in China or Denmark or America or Italy will eventually come to Australia, as it will to all other countries. So the propensity for the infection is the Neptune in Pisces sitting in the 9th house. But looking a little bit closer at the chart, I see that there are 4 planets in Capricorn in the 7th house. This is Jupiter in Capricorn and Mars in Capricorn and Pluto in Capricorn and Saturn in Capricorn. Now, we had a lineup of planets in Capricorn on the eclipse on Boxing Day last year, and 4 of them are still here. And what's happening there is that this contraction on an economic level is going to affect people. It's not just a government problem, it's not just an isolated bushfire community problem, it's people everywhere, people's livelihood, people's money in the bank, people's shares, people's ability to maintain their jobs. So the contraction of the society and the economic pain in this Australian Ingress chart is pretty immense. Yeah? Pretty immense. Saturn is sitting 7 degrees away from the door to the 8th house cusp. Now, if Saturn was closer to the door of the 8th house cusp, where we would expect severe mortality, severe death. It is within range. Now, just to give you an idea, if it was between 0 and 3 degrees, you'd say major loss of life as a result of pandemic or the inability to survive. So how do people pay their mortgages? Do people lose hope and despair? Is there self-harm? Do we end up with the vulnerable becoming more vulnerable, the homeless, more people out of work? Now, because Saturn is 7 degrees away, then I guess what I'd say that it's a moderate hit, not a major hit. That's in the first 3 months between March 21st and June 20th. We have a moderate hit to the economy, to business, to mortality. So generally speaking, however, Saturn is in the 29th degree of Capricorn. It is the void of course planet. So we have a government in crisis, we have a government struggling for debt, a government who will fail either because they haven't got the money, or they're not organised enough, or they simply don't care to protect the vulnerable people. It's hard to say which way it will go, but it will be one of those 3 reasons. They either choose to protect business and give business tax breaks, as we've seen the government do in the last week. They fail to protect the elderly, the disadvantaged, the Aboriginal communities, the people in prisons, the people who lose their jobs because they're in small business or they work in an industry where they've been asked to go home. So we have a moderate, not a minor, not a major, but a moderate impact. That's the Saturn, relatively close to the 8th house cusp. Clearly, we know from the statistics that the coronavirus will impact people older. I think they're saying the highest percentage of mortality will come from people in their 80s, with a fairly significant percentage of loss of life from people in their 60s and their 70s. That's Capricorn governs old age. So we can expect an absolute crisis in the elderly sector, in the aged care retirement sector, an absolute crisis with all the elderly people who live alone. Okay, what else can we see here? We have up the top of the chart, we have Uranus in Taurus and Venus in Taurus. So the government needs to act quickly and decisively and dramatically to put people before profit. If the Taurian focus is around money and profit and banks and business and propping them up at the expense of the socially vulnerable, then we will simply create more karma. One of the solutions from this Ingress chart is your local neighbourhood. This is the Earth sitting in the sign of Libra in the 3rd house. So it will become very important who's in your neighbourhood, who are your friends, who's your community, who can you share with, who can you give a bed to, all of those kinds of things. And equally, family networks like brothers and sisters and cousins and things like that. And we may well see that people have to draw upon those strength of neighbourly or family ties. Yes. Okay, the moon is in Aquarius in the 8th house. I think it was yesterday that the Australian government have asked people to social isolate. In my opinion, they're probably a couple of weeks too late, and they're still ridiculously suggesting that it's okay to go to universities, go to schools, go to the footy, etc., etc. Clearly, with the moon in Aquarius, one needs to be mindful of the distance in order to slow down the progress of the virus, as we have been told by the experts. Is it an easy 3 months in Australia? Absolutely not. Will there be a trade and an industry crisis? Absolutely. Will the tourism and trade sector pick up in the next 3 months? Not at all. Is it a great time to travel overseas, leaving Australia in the next 3 months? Absolutely not. Will the runoff from this crisis impact people's health and particularly the elderly? Yes. What degree of crisis will there be and strain on the medical and the government? It will be moderate. Not minor, not major, moderate. That's up until the 20th of June 2020. Yes. Okay. There's another thing that I will talk about here now, and this is I've taken the solar eclipse chart and wrapped it around the planet just to, let me see if I can find that chart on my computer. Yes. Wrapped it around the planet, and I'm going to zoom in on Australia just to see the impact of the eclipse on Australia. So what's immediately obvious to me is that the eclipse chart, hang on a second, have I got the right one? Yes, I do. The eclipse chart moves basically from Darwin across to the eastern states. The Uranus line goes from Darwin down to Kangaroo Island, and we know that Kangaroo Island was one of the most dramatic places that was decimated by the bushfires. The fact that Uranus goes through Darwin is a bit of an indicator to me that there could well be some major, it could be some other environmental thing that comes out of left field. I immediately think cyclone, into Darwin, because the Uranus line goes straight through Darwin. The Mars line in this chart goes through Mars. The Uranus in the eclipse chart falls right on the ascendant of the Australian Federation chart, and so our government and individuals and people need to be shocked out of complacency. The Mars line is far more dangerous from the solar eclipse chart because it falls too close, much too close to the mortality or the death point in the Federation of Australia's natal chart. So the likelihood of serious illness. Now, it may well be that people with life-threatening illnesses that are not to do with the coronavirus are unable to get access and support into the hospitals because of the overwhelm of people with the virus. Now, the Mars line goes off the east coast of Australia and effectively runs halfway between New Caledonia and the east coast of Australia. So I guess what I'd say about that is that really the Northern Territory, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania are all in the window of influence from the solar eclipse. However, the Saturn line and the Pluto lines go directly down through Western Australia, and they move down between Port Hedland and just south of Broome. So that immediately makes me think about what did I hear on the radio this morning, or TV yesterday, I think. I heard someone saying that the cruise ships are still coming into Broome. Now, this is very dangerous because we have a vulnerable Indigenous population who live along the coast and inland of Western Australia, and they are at the highest risk in Australia of viral contamination. So the fact that the cruise ships are still coming into somewhere like Broome, I find very concerning, because the Saturn and the Pluto lines run through that part of the chart. So what I'm going to do now is look at the Ingres chart, and again I'm going to overlay it across the Australian chart. Let me just find the right button to do that. Yes, and so the map that is the Ingres chart for March to June 2020 in Australia. Well, there are a few things to notice, and again, I see the crisis, the Chiron line, going through the northwestern part of Western Australia. So I immediately again think of the Aboriginal people in that region because the sun line is going there. So this is between Broome and Darwin. The coast between Broome and Darwin looks very susceptible or very vulnerable. Now, is this vulnerable because of the virus to the Indigenous people? Is it vulnerable on some other level through cyclones and the like? I'm not sure. Okay. I think that's probably all I'll say about that. So, in summary, really, we're in for a hard few months, and it's scaled on a moderate level. So if you think of 0 to 10 and 0 to 3 being very mild, and 3 to 7 being moderate, and 8 to 10 being extreme. We are at the top end of moderate. Now, okay, I will continue talking about the next Ingres chart and how it impacts Australia, and that will go from June 20th through until the equinox in September, and I'll also look at the next solar eclipse that's occurring on the 20th of June. So if you'd like to know more, just when you have the time and the inclination, listen to part 2 of The Great Change. Thanks, bye.